ataques.
1,087 attacks. For the third consecutive day, Russia carried out airstrikes against Ukraine's critical infrastructure. Ukrainian authorities recorded a total of 1,087 attacks in the past 72 hours. Despite this dramatic situation, Zelensky rejects the peace proposal promoted by the White House. Europe, meanwhile, stands firmly with Zelensky, while taking increasingly evident steps toward a direct war with Russia. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from Berlin, Germany. We begin live broadcast number 301 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us with a thumbs up against censorship, as well as through comments, subscriptions, memberships, and PayPal, of course, for those who wish to contribute. On the other side of the screen and the other side of the European continent, from Madrid, Spain, we are joined by Mr. Fernando Moragón. Fernando, how are things over there?
Nos acompaña el señor Fernando Moragón. Fernando, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Well, in this part of the ship, meaning the European continent, we're sinking just the same. No problem. I mean, there's a certain balance, a kind of uniformity in the European Union, in this descent into the unfathomable depths of the most terrible abysses that are coming our way. So yeah, we're doing fine. Anyway, I'm still dealing with my pharyngitis, better today, but still limping along. You know, these things that come with the cold. If anyone, please, some generous person with means, that is, with money, invites me to spend 6 months a year on a tropical island, that's it, 77 degrees all the time, I'm willing to accept and make my internet connections from there. So no problem, because the cold just kills me. I can feel it.
Yeah, for a Russian spy, that attitude of yours is hard to believe.
Well, but we can always find you one of those remaining British or French colonies. And there, yes, because there I can spy on you.
Querido Fernando,
Dear Fernando, 3 consecutive days of attacks on Ukraine, starting from Thursday to Friday night, then from Friday to Saturday, and now from Saturday to Sunday. Here are the images from the first of the attacks, an attack involving 137 drones. This was clearly a preparatory strike. Here's the image showing yesterday's flight paths. Then, after this preparation, came the largest of the attacks, with these trajectories spanning the entire width and breadth of Ukraine. The targets, and of course, a much higher number of drones. If you'll follow me now then, 104 attacks in total, if I remember correctly. Around 580 drones, the rest were missiles, both ballistic and cruise. And finally, today, in third place, an attack with 246 drones and missiles, including a Kinzhal missile or 2. The targets were basically the same as always. Ukraine's critical infrastructure, meaning energy, industrial and railway infrastructure, all of which are essential to sustaining the war effort. On top of that, Russian advances on the front have been increasingly rapid for the past 2 or 3 months. Zelensky's political situation, following corruption cases within his government, led to the departure of his right-hand man, making things increasingly complicated. Over the past 3 days, there were also meetings in Miami between Ukrainian envoys and Trump's envoy, Bitkov.
Bistoletti.
I'm not mistaken. Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law. Today, apparently, there was a phone conversation between Zelensky himself and Bitkov, but so far, Ukraine is rejecting the peace plan, and the Europeans are supporting Ukraine's position. Meanwhile, in Germany, since yesterday, a law establishes not only the introduction of voluntary military service at first and mandatory service later, but also that German lawmakers have now enacted the registration of all young people over 18 and the requirement of a medical exam. They've already started sending out the letters, my friends. Families, my friends with 18-year-old teenage children, already receiving summons for the medical exam to create the strongest army in Europe, in Mertz's own words. This is the general situation, Fernando. What analysis can we make in this context of the coming events? Of what we're going to witness, not too long from now?
Well, I could say something like, European citizens, please abandon ship, women and children first. Anyway, look, this is clear. We saw it the other day when we were celebrating the 300. I was going to say episodes as if it were a series. I mean the 300 episodes of Demoliendo, Mitos and so on. And well, the national security strategy itself is saying it. That is, it devotes more attention to Europeans than to other things. In other words, it's telling them, ladies and gentlemen, you're now going to serve two purposes, basically. One, so that we can keep extracting money from you, for example, through the sale of weapons, liquefied natural gas, and so on. This is already done. This doesn't exist anymore. They don't care what happens in Ukraine or not. And then, well, look, Ukraine doesn't interest us at all. I mean, Ukraine is an issue. We know it's a lost war. This isn't going anywhere. Now you have to manage the defeat. Your defeat. Because the Americans have already backed out and said, no, this is no longer ours. This is now up to the Europeans and the Ukrainians. So what we're going to see for the rest of the year and this winter is an increasingly severe Ukrainian collapse, where, well, in fact, some analysts are already considering scenarios and saying, well, careful, it's not good for Ukraine to hold elections in the near future. And they justify it, no more and no less, by saying that if elections are held, given the conflict between factions, it could lead to chaos, practically to a civil war. I mean, not because the problem isn't technical, whether it can be organized or not. And that reflects very well the situation in Ukraine. A country that is going to be defeated, that is going to be soundly defeated. I mean, they're not going to lose 2-1, they're going to get beaten 12. And it has now become a problem the European Union doesn't know how to get out of. Because let's not forget, the European Union is ruined in a process of remilitarization. But let's not forget that a good part of von der Leyen's famous $800 billion is going to end up in American coffers, in the U.S. military-industrial complex, which has to go around seizing frozen assets and is provoking that reaction among the Russians. The National Bank of Russia is causing tremendous internal tensions. And well, as you rightly said, with Germany saying that we're going to, well, Chancellor Merz saying that we're going to rebuild, who even added, again, just in case anyone had forgotten about World War II, so I'll remind them, once again the first army in Europe. Well, of course, deep down all of this is just justification. Justification that doesn't really change the fact that Europe is collapsing by its own doing. I mean, we're the ones who created the economic crisis. It wasn't caused by the Russians or the Americans. No, we caused it ourselves, among other things through self-imposed sanctions. And right now, all European governments are well aware that this is an economic disaster with no way out. So the only way forward is to keep pushing ahead, trying, which will fail, to build a stronger economy through defense investments. This worked for the United States at one point. It won't work for us. And secondly, to justify Russian aggression and so on, as a result of that devastating economic crisis. Dismantling social policies, cutting social budgets, and undermining freedom of expression. To justify an increasingly impoverished and totalitarian world. That's how it is. And there's nothing more to it. In other words, that's where we're headed. And the defeat, like I said, the educational defeat, is inevitable. But I read it somewhere, and we've talked about this countless times here. that Ukraine's birth rate right now is the lowest in the world and its mortality rate is the highest. And of course, that's just in a single month. Meaning, the data they gave was from the time when they had 30-some million people. And they said that by 2050, considering those 37, which apparently were millions, that is, by 2050, Ukrainians would lose 11 million people. Taking into account that the real figure isn't 37, but about 20, well, if you take 11 away from 20, you're left with 9. It's that simple. And there's no turning back. I mean, it doesn't matter even if the war ended tomorrow. And well, I think the Russians are going to take this all the way. That is, it doesn't matter. And besides, Trump wants them to do it. He can't come out and say, I want the Russians to massacre the Ukrainians, defeat them, and get this issue off my back. He can't say he's wishing for it. And he's buying time for himself and for Putin, so they can finish the job, finish the work.
Fernando, aquí algunas imágenes de la situación.
Fernando, here we have some images of the situation at the front and also in the rear of Ukraine. For example, this image is courtesy of Fernando himself, through his contacts there, right in the heat of battle. Pay attention to these images, they're truly striking.
Look at that mud pit. Incredible, walking on those planks they put down however they could, because otherwise you'd sink. Look at that car.
Up to the window.
Up to the window. And here, well, yeah, walking, because if you go off to one side, up to here, up to your chest. And here you can see other soldiers nailing wood however they can so people can get through. Because as you can see, this is flooded ground. It's a swamp. In the background, you can see in white the famous dragon's teeth, those anti-tank barriers. This is the harsh and brutal reality of war, not what they sell us together. And here, all we're seeing are the soldiers. Look at that mud pit. The mud is just incredible. Well, so, does anyone really think that Europeans, that European youth, especially in Western Europe, as you rightly pointed out, in Germany they're already saying, well, we're going to send them here to get measured and fitted and all that, referring to the young people who have already protested against Germany's move to reintroduce mandatory military service and who were already demonstrating. Do you really think this generation is willing to go fight the Russians and under these conditions? I mean, they wouldn't last 3 hours, they'd run away. Besides, we no longer have the physical, mental, or psychological strength to endure something like this. And here, it really doesn't matter whether they're Russians or Ukrainians. On either side, they currently have the ability to carry out military actions and endure the suffering that comes with it, something that doesn't exist in Europe. But we live very well. I mean, look, when I say we live very well, let's be clear. No, we're living worse and worse. But still, compared to many places, especially where there's war, life is very good. I mean, look, on weekends, you go out for a few beers, hang out, well, and with people who are only thinking about their own business. I mean, do you think they can be convinced to mobilize and go fight against the Russians? Especially knowing they're going to lose and it's going to be a massacre. Well, this is all madness, I'm telling you. All of it. And as we saw in those images, and that's not even the harshest part, this is the soft side of the war, so to speak. The hard part is something else. Well, really, if someone starts this, even if they bring back mandatory military service in Germany or wherever they want, if they send them to fight in Ukraine or against Russia in the Baltic, anywhere, it doesn't matter, they wouldn't last 3 minutes.
We didn't even last 3 minutes. Fernando, are these mud fields the result of the Rasputitsa? Because, if I remember correctly, the Rasputitsa, but this would be toward the end of the Rasputitsa, right? Yes, yes. Toward the freezing of winter, of the water, and of the surface.
It's in the months of October, November, and part of December. This varies quite a bit, of course, every year, depending on how the weather shifts. But yes, now in December we'll be entering winter, and the freezing will begin. It's not the same, but well, the front line is more to the south than to the north. Still, this is the result of the huge mud fields it creates. I saw a car there that almost got swallowed up. I remember, and you do too, tanks where only the turret was visible.
Because more images from Ukraine. Fernando, before we begin the more strictly military analysis, this is in a small Ukrainian town called Transcarpathia, a little village that decided to put up posters with the faces of those from the village who have fallen, the residents of that little town.
This is in the Transcarpathia region, where there is a significant Hungarian minority.
Pay attention to that image.
There you can see a lady walking, and let's say the fallen with a photo, and so on an avenue, on a promenade.
This isn't in Kiev, huh?
No, this is a marginal area of Ukraine, in quotes. It's right next to Hungary.
In the faces, many young people, but also, I went through the videos slowly, many older people, many grown-ups. There, for example, that man on the left, that man on the right, that man too, an older man, people in their 50s, 60s, and also young people in their 20s, right?
Of course, here we're seeing very young people, because obviously there's already a call from a member of the Rada and people from the establishment to mobilize everyone, and with absurd proposals saying they should mobilize everyone from 18 until they can barely stand, and whoever doesn't want to, let them leave. But if they leave, we'll strip them of their Ukrainian citizenship and so on. I mean, there are already ridiculous things happening. The fact is, they don't have enough personnel. It's a problem that can't be solved.
The other day, we presented the plans for the mobilization of women. Not just men anymore. They want to mobilize women too. Women here, in a place called, well, the name of the dam is different. I don't have the exact name right now. Let's see. Peshin. Oh no, well, Peshineski. Yes, according to the Russian transliteration, here it's shown as Peshiniji. This happened today, the destruction of a very large dam in this area, with the clear goal of isolating the region, presumably against Russian advances, right? That's at least how I see it. The dam is here, in the southern part of this rather large body of water. Here's the dam. It's visible on the map.
And look, this is important. Here we see a road that reaches the dam, goes over it, and then continues. Well, that was the main objective, to destroy that logistical communication line, more than blowing up the dam itself. Which, well, isn't easy at all, right? In fact, they haven't completely blown it up. They've damaged it a lot, and above all, they've damaged that road. But I mention it because destroying a dam is extremely complicated, even with current technology. I remember that during World War II, the British and the Americans were working on something that later became popularly known as the bouncing bombs, and they achieved some successes. It was meant to destroy, I don't remember, 6 or 7 major dams in Germany. Since it was so difficult to do it with bombers from above, what these bombs did was, like when you throw a stone with a spin over the water and it skips a few times. That's what they did.
They call it being a little duck. Yes, being a little duck. Little ducks, those little hops, surely.
Well, these bombs were round and called bouncing bombs. They would bounce until they hit the wall at a horizontal level, using the water to create that skipping effect, like when you skip stones. So imagine they had to come up with things like that because it's not easy to bring down a dam. So, and this logistics part, look, is crucial because that road connects the Kupiansk area and at the same time cuts off what comes from Kharkiv, if I'm not mistaken. That is the city of Kharkiv, because all of this is Kharkiv.
And here is the road heading toward Kupiansk, this way.
Indeed, which means they've cut off that road, which was the objective. And let's not forget that up there we have Volchansk, which has already been completely captured. In other words, that's it. It's not that there are 3 or 2 streets left. No, it's completely captured. And what they're doing now are advances that will keep pushing further south. There we can see the, I suppose those are FAP. Yes. Yes, they're falling.
Four 414 FAP.
Of course, it's just that, I mean, the firepower Russia has can't be matched by the Ukrainians with anything. They can't stand up to it. And they're producing more and more all the time. It's not that their production is decreasing, it's actually increasing. So of course you think this, and as I said, this is creating problems for them because, as we can see, it's no longer just about connecting Kupiansk, but, as we've discussed many times, about expanding during this winter the territories of that sort of triangle they've conquered in the Kharkiv region. So, well, this is the same thing again. I mean, constant pounding, a setback, and above all, what makes no sense. And it's something that, well, let's see if this makes sense, because it's a corrupt regime of politicians who couldn't care less about Ukraine. But anyway, for example, Retrocross and so on. I mean, keeping units there, surrounded, or at first half surrounded, then completely surrounded, makes no sense. Because I can understand that a commander-in-chief might say, I'm going to keep units in an area, even if they're half surrounded, if the sacrifice of those units makes it possible to withdraw to a rear area where the front can be stabilized by creating new fortifications, etc. For example, it makes sense, but sacrificing them for nothing, because you haven't done that. I mean, you haven't used, let's say, the sacrifice of the people who are there, trapped in Minograd, to create a second line that could stabilize the front or improve the Ukrainians' defense. It's a crazy thing. That is, well, it's an absolute disregard for your soldiers. And of course, if your most valuable resources are your men, they always are, but in this case especially, because you lack them, they're even scarce, then mistreating them this way doesn't seem like the best idea. But well, the Ukrainians will know what they're doing.
More images here of the situation on the battlefield.
Music, yes. Well, all right, Barazal. And here we see one of those buggies.
A little buddy pushing a little truck.
Yes, but notice how it's like old technology versus new. Neither one is that old, nor the other that new, but still. I mean, this is the classic minibus, one of those typical ones from the old Soviet Union or something like that. You can tell it's old, an old design, and well, it gets stuck there, and they have to come pull it out of the mud. The buggy would be something more modern. Right now, the entire front line is full of these kinds of buggies, motorcycles, and so on, because, for example, when it comes to moving through mud, they're much better than a truck or a pickup, not to mention an armored vehicle or a tank, which are useless here. But this was already something the Soviets and the Germans experienced in World War II, when their units were bogged down in many areas and couldn't advance. Well, the Soviets were more used to this, and also knew how to fight in those conditions. I remember a statement from World War II in which the Germans, when they invaded, wore footwear that was completely unsuitable for that terrain. It was footwear with soles nailed with metal studs. Problem: none in summer. But when winter came, your feet froze because the cold traveled through the metal, and amputations. The Russians didn't, the Soviets didn't. Because they had footwear that was glued together with some kind of adhesive and didn't use nails. I mean, things like that. You're playing on terrain, in the case of the Germans, of the Soviets who knew very well where they lived. Here both sides know it, both Koreans and Russians. But anyway, we're seeing innovation happening at a dizzying pace. We're seeing that there will be more developments in the war. And it's becoming increasingly clear to me. Tanks and armored troop carriers or support vehicles, etc., are going to be relegated to very marginal roles. I mean, current and future warfare is heading in other directions. And now we have that logistics is moving even farther away. How are frontline units supplied? Let's say units that are in a difficult situation nearby or cut off. How are they supplied? With drones. With ground drones and aerial drones. You can't physically get close with a truck. No, they'll destroy it. I mean, well, that's how it is. And yet we have European armies, the Germans, for instance, ordering who knows how many Leopards. But what for? I mean, don't you realize that the new Leopards, no matter how improved they are no longer... It's a bit like the battleships of World War II, which later disappeared because they no longer made sense. Well, this will be left for very limited functions. So, Europeans are still thinking in terms of a war, or a model of war, that no longer exists. One that has been overtaken by the kind of war that's coming back. In short, it's delusional. And as I said, right now the Russians are light years ahead of the Europeans, and when this war ends, they'll already have it. But really, they'll have an army with capabilities that the Europeans won't be able to build in 15 or 20 years, assuming they're even capable or willing to try. Honestly, I don't think they'll ever manage it. But on top of that, they're betting on a kind of war that no longer exists. Tanks, large armored and mechanized formations. If that can't move, that's it.
It's the site. Here, Fernando, an image just published on a Telegram channel showing the explosion of this dam. 1 second, please. It's still loading. Attention. There it is. Yes, there's the flash. And now the sound of the explosion. This was posted 15 seconds ago on a local Telegram channel from the area. That's the image of the explosion. Fernando, so far we've shown, on one hand, footage of the bombings, 1,087 attacks in the last 72 hours, and on the other, images of the faces of those who fell in a small Ukrainian village in Transcarpathia. Apparently, the name of the little town is Transcarpathia. At least that's what the browser translated for me when I downloaded this video. Mud, destruction of strategic infrastructure, destruction in this case of a dam. And here's the counterpart to that. The machinery for sending meat to this meat grinder, right? The machinery for forced recruitment and sending people to their deaths in this situation. We're going to show harsh, intense images. No blood, no injured people or anything like that, but strong images nonetheless. So, well, viewer discretion advised. This is in Odessa, right? Now then, pay attention. These were recorded yesterday in Odessa. We're showing them not because we take any pleasure in these harsh images, but because no mainstream outlet shows these videos that are posted daily, every single day, at least 2 or 3 of this kind, some even more striking. That's why, well, we're showing this one from yesterday. Here the recruits force open this truck, break the window, kick it out, and from there, they all escape. Passers-by and neighbors help them. The recruiters are overwhelmed and abandon the truck, even hitting it.
This is the situation in the streets.
Esta la situación en las calles, al principio visible la patada a la...
At first, you can clearly see the kick and people going out the window, escaping from there, with bystanders helping. I'm going to show another one. Yesterday I debated whether to show it or not. It's also very intense, but I'm going to show it. Yes, this is a tragicomic situation. Here the police are trying to move a man, but this man was lucky enough to be accompanied by man's best friend, a pit bull. And well, the pit bull is going to help him. No one was actually hurt after this, but the footage is very graphic.
Bueno, a ver, cuando el pitbull, no, el que no salió lastimado, según...
The one who didn't get hurt, according to what they said, was the dog. In fact, they asked and everything, and they said, no, the dog's fine. But one of those recruiters, judging by the screams he let out, well, he definitely got a good wound. Because a pit bull, you know, once it bites down, it locks on and doesn't let go.
Cuando cierra sus dientes, hace presa y no lo suelta.
Bueno, ahí los señores, además...
Well, those gentlemen, besides, the dog reacts because they were beating the owner with sticks, right?
Yes, yes, of course.
Not because the dog is violent or anything. There, well.
There, see, there's that guy, that hottie.
That's when they start throwing punches. And then the little dog. People kind of getting mixed up because of the dog. Well, and that's when the hitting with the little box starts.
But look how he catches him. How does he catch him?
But now, in just a bit, the big bite is coming.
Sure, look how he's shouting.
On the leg.
It's not a trivial matter. And now everyone's turning against him.
And now the other one is defending the dog. The owner defending the dog.
And in the end...
Alright, now for the other one.
Yes, chasing him. And the owner finishing off the one who was on the ground. Of course you think, well, they've got it coming. I mean, these people who forcibly recruit others know exactly what they're getting into. And if not, they can go to the front lines. They're thrilled to be here beating up defenseless people walking down the street. Well, this time they ran into someone who had a pit bull.
Pit bull award. Yes, several of them, actually, seen around. We're not going to show it, but there are several different shots from different people, focusing on the pit bull biting that man, and the desperate screams of those puppets. Always some big guys, armed. Well, they couldn't handle the pit bull.
When there are many of us, when we're big and strong, we feel superior. All tough, macho, and great. But then, when you run into a surprise like a pit bull, which is no joke, as we've seen, they start running like crazy and screaming because they're getting some serious bites. That's when things change. Like I said, unfortunately, it's always been that way throughout history. But those guys, so brave when they're in a group against some man just walking peacefully, well, those are the ones who should go to the front lines to fight for their country.
From these images, well, not with a pit bull, but every day, every single day, even when it comes to dogs, you see lots of images of people being forcibly recruited off the street, and they leave their dog there. Poor people, desperate, my dog, and they leave it there on the street. In some cases, the recruiters even steal the dogs, a purebred dog, something valuable. So they recruit the person and steal the dog. Things like that.
Truly Dantesque. Yes, because on top of that, of course no. On top of that, besides this role they're also thieves. I mean, they dedicate themselves to stealing everything they can from the people they recruit. So basically, you're looting your own population. Well, they don't deserve one pit bull. They deserve 14 for each of them. and then we'll see who's laughing. Like I said, for example, look, one thing is the person, right or wrong. I don't care if they're Russian, Ukrainian, or Czechoslovak. It's just not the same. That is to say, he defends what he believes is, well, the best for his country, and he defends it on the battlefield. All my respect in principle. However, those who, just to avoid going to the battlefield, are willing to do whatever it takes, and there have been quite a few cases of recruits killed by this scum, meaning they then go on to rob their own fellow citizens. To them, not a drop of water, not a drop. They're scum. It is what it is. As I said, they deserve not just a pit bull, but much worse.
Here, dear Fernando, we're going through, via the images in this broadcast, the different dimensions of the conflict in Ukraine, the geopolitics of the conflict in Ukraine, but through concrete images, the battlefield, recruitment, the attacks. Well, now it's Europe's turn, the Germans in particular. Here's Chancellor Merz, currently on a tour in Israel, and making one blunder after another, by the way. This is from just a few days ago, precisely hours after the approval of the law for the registration and medical examination of everyone over 18, following, of course, the approval of voluntary military service for now, but soon to be mandatory, no doubt. Here's Merz with his analysis of the situation in Germany. By the way, in the latest poll, a new record for negative ratings, this man has a positive image of 14%, and everything else is negative. Between negative and don't know, no answer, was around 86%.
Alternative for Germany, little by little, is growing, let's say, as the Christian Democratic Party declines. That is, the German one.
Yes, okay. And the value of the rates and expenses in public services, that with this financial benefit we're offering together, we can no longer fulfill the social promises we've made together for years and decades. We live in our country based on those relationships.
Well, this is great. This is great. I mean, what these people are doing is great. Really, what European politicians are doing is ridiculous. Well, folks, we're ready to become the leading military power in Europe. That's what the money is for. To keep sending money with no control whatsoever, because we send it with no control whatsoever, either directly through Germany or through the European Union over there to the war in Ukraine. Let's not forget, Ukraine is neither part of the European Union nor part of NATO, but it's a mess. But of course, we no longer have the production or the capacity to maintain the situation we once had. On top of that, the guy has the nerve to say that we can no longer keep our promises. But how can he come out and say that? The cynicism of these people has no limits, right? So from now on, we'll have to understand that since European politicians, specifically the Germans, can't keep their promises, as Merz says, well, that's it. We already know that when they promise something, they're lying. Which one? They're lying to us. Well, and the guy, as I said, says we have money to fight the Russians, who aren't any kind of threat, but whatever. What Mr. Merz will never tell you, nor the previous one, nor Scholz, nor any of them, is why they no longer have money for the well-being of Germans, to maintain the welfare state, and so on. Why don't they have it? Could it be because they've done a terrible, no, worse than terrible job managing European resources, and specifically German resources? Could it be that Nord Stream 1 and 2 have left Germany, as all German business people admit, without the cheap gas that was key to German prosperity? You've shot yourselves in the foot, in the liver, in the head, and now you tell me there's no money for healthcare, for education, and that we're living beyond our means. Honestly, the rhetoric from these people is just... As for European politicians now, I don't even want to say anything outrageous, because you know how it goes, but really they deserve a beating. I mean, they say, come on, have you no shame? On top of that, Europe is the Europe of corruption. Mogherini the other day. But really, what does it matter? They're all the same. I mean, the fallacy that the European political class is using in every country and at the level of the European Union is that I don't understand how there are still people who believe it. That is, no, corruption is just isolated cases. But most politicians are here out of pure love for the art, right? Because we have such a strong sense of ability in public service that it drives us to take on these juicy political positions. And people still believe that speech. Let's be honest, politics, if it ever was. But in any case, nowadays is a way to get rich, not a form of public service. That no longer exists. Corruption is the rule, the constant, permanent rule. What's rare, and you have to look for it with a magnifying glass, is the politician who isn't corrupt. There are 4 of these. 4. But all of this is already within a circus-like framework, where every point of reference has been lost. Anyway, and Germany is the clearest example. From the nonsense Merz says to, he says, let's see, the Germans have a problem, but a psychological one, a psychiatrist's case. And right now we're seeing the so-called traditional German parties, that is mainly the Social Democrats, the CDU, the Christian Democrats, and the Greens, staunchly defending the war against Russia, the supposed defenders of liberal democracy, and so on, and trying to censor as much as possible, throwing people out into the streets for saying things that don't follow the official line, and so on. In other words, they're destroying freedom of speech. Those who claim to have always defended all their lives freedom of speech and all that. On the other hand, we have the far right, Alternative for Germany, which even includes a neo-Nazi minority, let's call things what they are, and which is arguing against going to war with Russia, attacking traditional parties because they want to destroy freedom of speech. And on top of that, it's led by a woman who, I say this with all due respect, clearly doesn't fit the usual mold. She's a lesbian, doesn't even live in Germany, lives in Switzerland, and has an adopted son. That is to say, 1, 2, I think that's it. This is the picture that Germany gives us at the moment. And with a business class that is now being forced due to the disaster, for example in the automotive sectors, to convert into military companies. Hey, if before they made a car, now they make an armored military vehicle, what's the difference? This is the delusion, and the loss of direction, of reference points. Well, that's where we are. Can anyone expect anything positive from this Europe? Certainly not. But anyway, that's where we are, and as I said, the mental chaos in Europe is spectacular.
El caos mental que hay en Europa es espectacular, es decir, y eso se ve en el caos político y ya digo.
And you can see that in the political chaos and in a system made for certain European elites who live off Europe, off Europeans, off their taxes, and who also have no scruples whatsoever. And what she does, let's say, at least aesthetically, is shocking. She has no qualms about showing it. I mean, before, at least they half hid it and so on. Not anymore. Now they're corrupt and openly defend being corrupt, right? There's something that really makes me laugh. Because this is our daily bread in Spain, you know? You see it all the time. That is, when someone gets caught doing something outrageous or involved in corruption, whether it's them, their party, their regional government, or wherever, they come out and say, I take full responsibility for what has happened. And then they ask him, so are you going to resign? And he says, no, I'm not going to resign. But what kind of accountability is that? I mean, that's what it's come to. No, I take full responsibility, but I'm not resigning. Well, then what responsibilities are you actually taking? This is the most cynical, the most pitiful face of something that has never been a democracy, and even less so now what we call Western liberal democracies. which are a scam. They always have been, but now the scam is just more visible.
Yes, with Mertz's words in Israel, we're going to respond to Emilio Guizar's question. Thank you very much for the support. Will Europeans gradually end up trapped in the militarization of their youth, in the same way they've sent the Leopards, HIMARS, and Abrams? Yes, they have indeed already begun, Emilio, with militarization, and not only through increased military spending, but also through the reform of military systems, including recruitment through mandatory or voluntary military service, but mandatory if they don't generate a sufficient number of recruits. So this process has already begun, dear Emilio. Here, for example, Merz in Israel today. These are his words about Israel, saying the following. By the way, remember the context, because there are many speeches here. But we must remember that Germany took part in Israel's genocide against Palestine, against Gaza, by sending weapons to crush Gazan civilians. Israel's main arms supplier is the United States. The second is Germany. And regarding, when asked about the Palestinians' right to their own state. A right, by the way, enshrined by the United Nations, by the Security Council, and so on. He replied, "Thanks to the mediation of President Donald Trump, we have reached a ceasefire in Gaza. There are always setbacks. The attacks on Israel, even against the civilian population, are those setbacks. But well, there always are. The war, which lasted 2 years, is over, and peace, a lasting peace, is possible. We believe that the possibility of establishing a Palestinian state alongside Israel probably offers the best outlook for the future." A two-state solution can only be achieved, however, through negotiations, and it will be the result of those negotiations. But such negotiations are undoubtedly necessary. The federal government maintains its position that the recognition of a Palestinian state can only come at the end, not at the beginning, of that process. Therefore, the federal government provides assistance to the Palestinian Authority. This authority can rightly be criticized in many respects. I do so myself. I spoke with President Abbas about this yesterday morning, but especially now, since there are reform initiatives, we must support them. Well, yes, he criticizes the Palestinian Authority, obviously not the Israeli government. But Germany's position is clear in this regard. Theoretically in favor of two states, but in the future. The demand for two states now, no, no, no. And even though a good number of European countries, major powers of the past, in light of the atrocities carried out by Netanyahu's government, decided to change their stance and formally recognized the existence of the Palestinian state. More as a symbolic gesture than anything else. Spain, France, the United Kingdom, well, not Germany. We want a Palestinian state, yes, but in the future as the result of negotiations. Negotiations so far have been marked by the genocide of the civilian population in Palestine and by the shipment of German weapons to Israel to crush the Palestinians. This is the level of cynicism of these people. By the way, let's also recall Netanyahu's statements, because while he talks about in the future, two states, Netanyahu responds more and more openly. Those states, never, ever. He states it explicitly against international law, even against statements made by former Israeli prime ministers in the past. With this, in the future we want. Now not even that. Well, there you have the hypocrisy, the cynicism, the sadism of these disgraceful individuals.
I mean, look, I think these people, don't ask me why, the Germans seem to have specialized in genocides, their own and others. I mean, really, what a record they have. They started with the genocide of the Herero in Namibia, then with the Jews in World War II, and not just them, they also killed 3 million Soviets. In short, they went all in. And now, it's like they find it too much trouble to do it themselves directly, but they support the state of Israel. As you rightly pointed out, after the United States, 30% of the weaponry was supplied by Germany. And they go there calmly to talk with Netanyahu, who has always, this he's been consistent about, defended that there cannot be two states. That is, there's only one state, Israel, and the Palestinians are either expelled or eliminated. In this, yes, more or less you could say he's always defended the same thing. And this guy here, telling us the story about, in the future, two states. What a shameless person when you know that's not going to happen. I mean, how do you have the nerve to go there and start? Well, that to say no, but the Palestinians and all that, we talk with Mahmoud Abbas and so on. When you know all this is a farce, that we're in perfect peace, Kant's famous title comes to mind, that we're in peace forever and so on, whatever. Except for these inevitable setbacks. Setbacks meaning that the Israelis bomb one day and the next. We already know that, as the agreements with Israel are understood, both parties commit to honoring them. One of them, the one that isn't Israel, not only makes commitments but actually has to fulfill them. The other one makes commitments but doesn't follow through. That's how they understand agreements. And when it became clear and proven that this was nothing more than a way to give Netanyahu a hand so he could ease the pressure over the hostage issue, the hostages were returned, and that was it. In other words, there's nothing more to discuss. By the way, there's something curious, something to keep an eye on, well, curious, let's say, about this guy, Netanyahu. Because we already remember Trump's famous remarks in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, saying, admit Netanyahu, Mr. President Herzog, admit him. Well, so Netanyahu, shameless, no one beats him at being shameless. I mean, he said, just like Trump did, I'm submitting my pardon request. Because if Trump can say it with all that nerve, and then Herzog told him, well, he'd grant it, but under certain conditions, among them a permanent and definitive exit from politics, meaning he has to leave it. Fine, you won't go to jail, but you can't run for any public office anymore, and you have to stay out. That and a few other things. Let's see how it all ends, because at this point, one expects any kind of twist. That this man gets pardoned and walks away scot-free. Well, that's where we are. So, of course, well, as things are being prepared, let's not forget that besides Palestine, the Israelis also keep attacking Lebanon periodically, just because they feel like it, for no reason at all, no provocation from Hezbollah or anything like it, since they do whatever they want. Well, what's the harm, right? And also, from time to time, well, a bit of malice like that, so they don't forget. And watch out. The problem is that they're mulling over how to carry out a second war against the Iranians, this time successfully. The problem is that it's very hard for it to go well for them. We already saw that the 12-day war went terribly for them. And watch out, because there are rumors. I don't remember who said it, these things are impossible to know. People should take it with a big grain of salt, but I don't remember who said it. That someone confessed not too long ago that he was an American negotiator, someone involved in the mess, that Trump carried out that fake bombing over the areas or sites of Iran's civilian nuclear program, as we've all said, to get the Israelis out of a war they were losing. But that was because the Israelis had threatened the Americans that if they didn't lend them a hand, they might resort to nuclear weapons. We're dealing with a bunch of lunatics, right? I mean, like, the worst in this sense are the lunatics like Motrich and Ben Gabir and so on, who have an apocalyptic religious component and say, well, let's all head for the apocalypse, and that way we speed up the process, right? And then, but well, others like Netanyahu aren't like that, because those are Zionists, but non-believing Zionists. I mean, they're atheists. What they're after is stealing and, well, other stuff. They're hyper-nationalists, racists, and so on. But no. Anyway, that's what they were saying. And as for the current Israeli government, well, one can expect anything from them, and nothing good.
Fernando, back to Europe. This is the current situation in Kiev. Images from just minutes ago, completely dark. Even though, at least tonight, Russian attacks haven't started yet. Maybe they'll start later, maybe not. That's the current situation. Some light somewhere, a candle, a battery-powered lamp. But the city of Kiev is dark, as is much of Ukraine. The heating systems have been destroyed, and naturally the electrical systems too. So a very difficult winter is beginning. Meanwhile, Europeans want more money to sustain this war, especially after Trump's apparent decision to withdraw from the Ukrainian stage, to abandon Europe, to stop sending money and weapons as before. Hence the urgent need for fresh funds in Europe. And this led, for example, to a very interesting analysis by this man, a certain Chris Weber. I don't know this man, whether he's good or bad, but his analysis is interesting. All of this video, by the way, courtesy of our sister channel on Telegram, Wars and Geopolitics, recommended to everyone who wants up-to-the-minute information and analysis on geopolitics on Telegram. Wars and Geopolitics, our friends on Telegram. This is his analysis of the situation following the latest debates. All Europeans want, all European leaders want, the seizure of the $300 billion in European funds held in Belgium. But the Belgians reject this. Logically, they reject it, because it would have immediate consequences, in fact against the entire Western financial system, but first and foremost against the Belgians. And that's why the debates. Here's this man's explanation. Pay attention.
Hi, I'm Chris Weber, and today I want to talk about the company Euroclear and Russia's 180 billion euros. A small piece of news. The rest of the planet has no problem with Russia. Neither China, nor India, nor the Saudis, not even the Americans. Only the countries of the European Union and NATO have a problem with Russia. If we now steal the Russians' 180 billion, other countries might get the idea that we'll be the next to steal their money. And the firm Euroclear has 42 trillion in assets, not trillions of trillions. If now the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, and others take those 42 trillion, then the firm Euroclear dies, the European financial system dies, your bank dies, your money is confiscated, and your account disappears. Remember that.
Well, short and clear. Sure, but the thing is, even the Belgians themselves, scared, are refusing as best they can, because they're saying this is the end of Belgium, the end of Europe, the end of everything, since trust, which is essential in these matters, would be broken. And from now on, a precedent has been set, and no one can trust that they won't be next. I mean, if today you freeze Russia's assets, well, better not, but careful. We're not talking about freezing, we're talking about taking it and giving it to the Ukrainians, which is something very different. Today you steal it from Russia, then tomorrow it could be China, Zimbabwe, anyone. So, well, I'm turning it around here, turning it around, and there we go. And above all, the big global investors are going to keep running. The Saudis and company are going to say, me here in Europe just to get expropriated, you know what, I'll stay out of it in the future in case there's some mess or something like that. No, I mean that would already be outright economic suicide. By the way, I've got a guy here, an old acquaintance, we've mentioned him before, this good man who of course has a tough job, because he appears in Ukraine to deliver bad news, so you think, damn. Anyway, his name is Vitaly Zaichenko, and he's the head of Ukrenergo, the Ukrainian state energy company. And he came out and said, if you start giving bad news, you're going to tell how bad the disaster is, he says.
eliminar las consecuencias del ataque ruso realizado recientemente.
Eliminating the consequences of the recent Russian attack on the power infrastructure could take several weeks. He said that power outages could last up to 16 hours, added the head of Ukrenergo. Just so you see how things are. And they're probably downplaying it, huh? I mean, because having to go out there and say, no, look, I've got bad news. We already know. If you're the one from Ukrenergo, it's not going to be good news. Well, this is the disastrous situation we're in. And that's why I say it. Europe is on the path to absolute suicide. Because between the corruption of our leaders and the fact that they're incompetent, clumsy, useless, illiterate, it's a perfect storm.
In recent days, Fernando, we've witnessed the emergence of a narrative, a rhetoric in the mainstream media, in which Europe appears as the one responsible for the war in Ukraine, both the loser and the culprit. And, on the other hand, the United States is beginning to appear as a victim or a stakeholder in the resolution of the conflict. This aligns with the apparent movement of the United States toward Europe, and with China stepping away from the European stage. Something, by the way, debatable in terms of its actual implementation. We've discussed this here on more than one occasion. Trump presented this as a campaign promise, withdrawing from Ukraine, moving closer to Russia, and redirecting US foreign policy against China. Well, so far, it has taken contradictory steps in this regard. But since Trump's peace plan, about a week and a half or two ago, US media, and even European outlets, have begun portraying Europe, along with Ukraine, of course, as the only party interested in continuing the war and as the loser in this conflict. Meanwhile, the United States is starting to be presented as a mediator or a peace broker, when in fact it was the United States that drove this conflict from the beginning. But that narrative is emerging, it's taking shape, and in it, Europe appears in the worst possible scenario, abandoned by the United States, losing the war, and perhaps even facing a direct conflict with Russia.
En un conflicto directo con Rusia. Ahora bien, cerrado este paréntesis, Fernando.
Now then, with that parenthesis closed, Fernando, what is the interpretation? What interpretation should we make of someone like Trump, with so many promises of we're going to end the war in Ukraine, but without actually following through on those promises? Let's present two analyses from two very serious analysts, and then I'd like your opinion, Fernando, on Trump and his contradictions, whether he wants the continuation of the war in Ukraine or not. First, Jeffrey Sachs, with whom I hope to have a conversation soon on the English channel. We'll get there. For me, he's one of the most insightful geopolitical analysts out there, even though he's actually an economist. Here.
Aquí su análisis sobre Trump. Atención.
His analysis of Trump. Attention. It feels like Trump's politics are based on the last person he talked to.
Policy is based on the last guy that he talked to. And
Bien. Aquí la posición crítica de...
All right. Here's Sachs's critical stance on Trump, with all its twists and turns. And here's another position from another critical analyst, Colonel Douglas McGregor. At some point, we'll do an interview with him as well. All of this will probably happen next year, when we focus our English language channel much more than we do now. Here's Douglas McGregor. Pay attention to Trump and, well, Ukraine, Venezuela, and so on.
Trump has great instincts, but then he walks into the swamp, and he gets mugged early.
And he moves early, and people distract him in areas that are unfamiliar to him. They're going to put an end to his presidency if he messes with Venezuela. That place is a terrible, terrible harm to us. We can't fix it, and we shouldn't try. Let the people who live there handle it. And if they say they can't, well, that's their problem. Remember, Venezuela has 1,700 miles of coastline, 1,370 miles of border with Colombia, and 1,380 miles of border with Brazil. And people with experience there tell me there are about 100,000 paramilitaries on the border with Brazil and Colombia who just can't wait to enter Venezuela and fight against us if we go into that country. And this kind of thing will spread, It's the last thing we need. What we need is stability and peace. I urge the president to reconsider his rejection of this proposal from Maduro and to get out of this regime change business, especially when it's known that someone like Machado is playing a nefarious role.
Particularly when you know that somebody like Machado is playing to the wrong audience.
Bien, el general Douglas
Well,
MacGregor, no solo
General Douglas MacGregor, not about Trump himself, but about Trump's contradictions. And finally, another excellent critical analyst as well. After this, Fernando, I'd like to hear your opinion. Here's Scott Ritter on Trump and the possibility of an attack on Venezuela, also with subtitles.
Ran on a platform of peace. His voters.
Trump presented himself on a peace platform. His voters are pushing him toward this issue. The American people don't want war, and we definitely don't want a war with a neighboring country that could trigger a massive migration crisis, where refugees from a country whose society has collapsed, whose economy has collapsed, are now fleeing. And where are they going to go? North to the United States. We already have a migration crisis. We don't need to make it worse.
We have an immigration crisis. We don't need to be fueling it.
Bien, entonces Sachs primero.
Well, then, Sachs first points out Trump's contradictions, describing him as an unstable and stupid person. MacGregor sees him as someone with good instincts, but unable to carry out his policies because of the swamp surrounding him, partly due to ignorance as well. And here Scott Ritter presents Trump's contradictions. This idea of an election campaign against war, and now attacking fishing boats in the Venezuelan, Colombian, and, well, also Surinamese and Trinidad and Tobago Caribbean, and so on. Your interpretation of Trump, dear Fernando.
Tu interpretación sobre Trump, Fernando querido.
Pues yo creo que hay un poco de todo, que evidentemente.
Well, I think there's a bit of everything. Obviously, Trump isn't exactly a bright mind, and he's a guy with only basic knowledge of international politics and so on. That's pretty clear. And as we all more or less know, he really depends a lot on whoever last whispered something in his ear, whether it's about Ukraine, Venezuela, or whatever. We're aware of the internal contradictions within his own administration. For example, one of the strongest advocates for invading Venezuela is Marco Rubio, his Secretary of State. At the same time, he's also a defender, of course, if you're focusing on Venezuela, of abandoning Ukraine. That makes no sense at all. And then on the other hand, there are also, well, the tensions within his administration. And ultimately, there's one thing we must not lose sight of, and that is that Donald Trump, yes, he's the president of the United States, okay? He has quite a bit of power, but he's not the one in charge. Let's be clear about that. Neither Marco Rubio, nor, well, at least the Secretary of War, nor any of those people. In the end, those who really rule are what we call the deep state, or, to be more specific, for example, the CIA. And if not, well, I was going to say, ask, not him, because he's dead, but his family, John F. Kennedy, who really runs things, because it cost him his position and his life. In other words, let's not forget that. Right now, I think there's an internal debate, but it goes beyond Trump. Trump is the visible face, the executor. But there's an internal debate because the elites who truly hold power in the United States haven't yet reached a clear consensus on different policies. Regarding the policy of confronting the Chinese, on one hand, they're realizing they're late to that confrontation. That's why they're increasingly using strategies to destabilize China's surroundings. That is, to create chaos in the countries around China. Second, the so-called Plan B that was mentioned the other day. We withdraw from most of the world, at least in military and other terms, and focus on America, meaning the American continent for the United States. They see him as a kind of Monroe 2.0. Then, as I said, a more warlike imperialism against the Russians. I mean, in the end, let's not forget one thing. Biden, Trump, all the previous presidents are imperialists. What differs are the strategies and even more the tactics. But anyway, Trump came in with a basic idea of war. We're pulling out of the war in Ukraine. The Russians can do whatever they want. We'll focus on the Chinese. We'll go after them. And along the way, we'll strike at that unbeatable triangle in Asia, Russia, China, Iran. We'll take out Iran. That's what the Israeli aircraft carrier is for. But, of course, events unfold very quickly. And since these aren't well-structured ideas, but rather very general ones, we end up with a Trump who, as events unfold, changes his stance because he didn't expect the Israelis to be defeated in the 12-day war so quickly. By the fourth day, they were already asking Trump to intervene, because otherwise the Iranians would have left the place in ruins. In other words, there's more to this. Why? Because there's a lack among much of the elites, and especially among their advisors, of real knowledge about the world. And this happens, well, that's one part of it. That is, the guy who's supposed to tell you what's going on in a country you don't even know where it is, to put it simply, is giving you a terrible analysis. Then you, who have to make a decision based on what's presented to you, if all the options you're given are terrible or you don't have a plan B or plan C, etc., well, in the end, that's a disaster. Then there are also internal problems. For example, what I want is to move up, let's say, in the Pentagon among the generals. And if I want to move up, since top appointments are ultimately political, what I can't do is oppose a president. And if a president wants to invade Mars, I'm going to present him with a plan to invade Mars, even though I know that's completely unfeasible. I don't care. But he'll be satisfied, and he'll promote me. Which means there's a problem with the generation and proper training of those who have to develop it, and then of those who supposedly make the decisions. This creates this kind of nonsense, like what's happening in Venezuela. You might say, no, the problem, let me be clear, is ethically, absolutely reprehensible. But the problem for the United States isn't that they want to invade Venezuela. I understand that they might want to invade Venezuela to get oil because they need Venezuela's oil. Now then the question is the objective, keeping Venezuela's oil. Fine. First, design the apparently least costly plans. And if you negotiate with the Venezuelans, ease the pressure on them, and in exchange sign, let's say, exclusive contracts for American companies, then maybe that's much easier than what you're thinking. That is to say, later on, if you choose military action, you'll have to analyze the consequences of those military actions, as Scott Smith pointed out. I mean, well, let's see. Venezuela has a long border with Colombia, with Brazil. Guerrillas could form, and they could drag on forever. What do you want? Another Iraq? It seems not. In other words, all this shows a tremendous lack of analytical capacity in the imperial power, which is also a nuclear power, and that's why it's caught up in the messes it's in, because it doesn't calculate or make good analyses. And that's the reason why almost always, unless it has to fight a dwarf, it loses wars. Because they're not capable of making those objective analyses. And so, well, there you have it. They could really mess things up for you. Today it might be Venezuela, but tomorrow it could be anywhere else. Because they mistakenly believe they can defeat this country, that one over there, that they can bomb and that it won't have consequences beyond protests at the United Nations. No, that's not how it works. It's that you have, let's say, terrible strategic political thinking. Really terrible. And this is happening more and more to the United States. Hence the constant clumsiness. And as I said, obviously the internal struggle between different geopolitical positions among the American elites also has a lot to do with it. Because on one hand, some tell you do this, and others tell you do the opposite. And Trump, well, he keeps swinging back and forth. That is, depending on who's whispering in his ear.
Pero estos son las contradicciones internas que cada vez
But these are the internal contradictions that are becoming more and more obvious within the imperial power. And that's part of what makes it dangerous, right? A strategic, rational, long-term actor, like China, for example, may be more or less peaceful, but in any case, we know it will act carefully, weighing every step, considering all its goals, how they can be achieved, whether through peaceful trade or, if necessary, through military means. In other words, it's a rational actor. These ones are not. I mean, there they are. And the Europeans, don't even get me started. The Europeans are completely out of control. It's a joke. Well, that's what we've got. Look, I'm telling you because it's the latest thing. Macron always surprises us. Macron in China, in China, in China.
I'm going to accompany your analysis with images, Fernando. Pay attention to Macron in China, okay? Pay attention to this.
Let's see, it scares me. What are you doing? What are you doing?
Playing ping pong there, Macron. My goodness, my goodness. But it's two Chinese players against Macron and a Chinese woman, part of the Olympic teams of China and France, apparently. This is the highlight of the tour. This is the only thing Macron has done more or less well. Macron playing ping pong.
He's not a genius, but... And that's when he got up from the table, right? Yes, that's it. He put the second one in his place. But anyway, we already know that politicians, just to gain popularity, are capable of doing anything. This has always been the case. But anyway, Macron, who is in a country, as we all know, a small country, a country with no population, no importance, economically irrelevant. Militarily, it carries less and less weight in the world. And he more or less told the Chinese, he said he informed them that if they don't react, that is, if China doesn't take measures to resolve the trade deficit problems with the European Union, we Europeans will be forced to take drastic measures in the coming months and interrupt cooperation, following the example of the United States, for instance, and imposing tariffs on Chinese products. Right now, Xi Jinping has diarrhea. Diarrhea from laughing so hard. These people, I'm telling you, you go over there supposedly to maintain good relations with the Chinese and all that, because you don't have many alternatives left. And then you say, hey, either you do what we want, because we're the great European power, and don't even get me started on the French, or else we'll crush you. And of course, the Chinese are like, wait a second, this guy has serious psychological problems. Well, the problem is that we'll probably go through with it. So if we try to launch a trade war against the Chinese, we'll go straight back to the Neolithic, skipping the Middle Ages entirely. Straight to the Neolithic. You'd have to be crazy. I mean, look, you can put pressure, you can on the Chinese or on anyone, when you actually have something to use as leverage. Europe has nothing to use as leverage. You can't just go to China and say, either you do what we want or you balance this situation, the trade balance. Well, if you're buying more from the Chinese, try selling more to them. How is it my fault that your products are worse? I mean, well, no, let's go for it. We stand our ground and tell them, a trade war, if not, then learn from the United States, which had to back down when it saw that a trade war was wrecking the American economy. But anyway, these are the useless people we have steering the ship.
Do they want more of Macron in China? Yes, yes, a ping-pong match, and if not, also a track race. He never misses a chance to generate somehow attention, to draw attention, to be in the spotlight. So this started, pay attention to this madness, with his whole entourage of desperate bodyguards behind him, in China, supposedly running.
There's the chubby guy. There's the chubby guy. He's having a really hard time, huh? A bodyguard, I can see he's struggling.
Running from one side to the other to greet his fans. That could be indeed very athletic. Let's remember the run that he
sí.
I think he should compete in the next Olympics, because we saw Macron with incredible speed, an extraordinary sprint, leaving his bodyguard behind, just like now. The last one there, the blonde guy, is having a terrible time. If you look closely, there he is. I'm not cut out for this. I'm here so that if someone shoots at him, I can step in the way, but not to keep up with this man running away from, well, in this case, running toward his fans and all that.
Anyway, either that, or he was seen running away from Brigitte because he was involved in another incident while getting off the plane. Another slap. And apparently this time it happened off camera. But as he was coming down the stairs, he went back up into the plane again. Once inside, there was a very tense moment, and finally Brigitte came out with him, holding his arm, but as if... I can already picture it. In there, as if he'd been slapped once more, like that time when he got off the plane. This Macron. Oh, by the way, Macron's approval rating is at 14%, extremely low. A new record in that regard, the lowest approval rating in France since 1981. And now he's down to 11%.
Well, I trust him. I trust Macron. I think he can overcome it, and that he could fall even further. I mean, without a doubt, come on. But anyway, this really, let's see, I can interpret the thing with Brigitte. The thing with Brigitte was more or less probably that he said to her, "Come on, we've arrived, let's get out." Macron says this to Brigitte, and she's like, "Well, I'm not getting out, I'm busy doing other things." And he's like, "Come on, we have to get out." Macron didn't respond. Boom, a slap to Macron, the other one there recovering and all that. Digit, you're gonna make me look bad and all that. Well, fine, I'll go down with you. But on the condition that when we get to the Élysée, you let me scrub half of it because it's really dirty, or something like that. Because we already know what I would do. It's quite clear to me, the President of France, well, I'm not saying Presidenta because it sounds wrong to me. The President of France is Brigitte. That is, the President of France is Brigitte. Macron is the consort, but the one in charge there is Brigitte. It's obvious. So, well, this man has serious psychological problems. I'm quite sure of it.
How many years older than him? 20 years? 30 years? Something like that, right?
When he... I don't quite remember the story, but something like... Yes, the story was that he was studying what would be high school or something like that.
Something like that.
And she was his teacher of something or other. So from there, this is the official version, right? From there, it's not at all clear that the official version is the true one. From that point on, a relationship begins. She was married and all that, then she gets a divorce, and so on, and this whole story. But you know that Candace Owens claims, and that's why the lawsuits, which is also insane, but anyway, she claims that Brigitte isn't Brigitte, that the birth name was that of a man, let's say, a specific other person's name, and therefore there's a rather dark story behind it. Because among other things, when Macron, although that's been adjusted over time, supposedly started this relationship with Brigitte, he was underage. And of course...
The real issue then, whether Brigitte is a cis woman or a trans woman, well, that's her business, her own matter, her decision. Now, if this woman, according to what Shashi Petit helps me with here, started a relationship with Macron when she was 39 and he was 15 at the time, at the beginning of the relationship, didn't she commit an act of pedophilia? From what age is it allowed in France?
I don't know, but I think 16 or 17, though I'm not sure.
Here in Spain, 39. What a story, Fernando.
Yes, there are books published on the subject, quite juicy ones.
Well, if someone wants to. Fernando, if it were the other way around, a 39-year-old guy involved with a 15-year-old girl, his political career would be over, because, oh, pedophile, how terrible. And rightly so. because 15 is still a kid. But since it's the other way around, a woman with a boy, they kind of present it as a love story. But the lady was 39 and Macron was 15.
La señora con 39 y Macron con 15.
That's why I say, well, there are a lot of shady things in this relationship between Brigitte and Macron. There's an interview I want to watch. I think it's possible. Well, it's in English, but with artificial intelligence and all that, it can be subtitled. It's done by Candace Owens, I don't remember the exact name, with a Frenchman who wrote a book about this whole story. And in fact, it has led Macron and Brigitte to sue Candace Owens in court for defamation, etc., etc. But it's just insane. I mean, a president, regardless of what Brigitte is, whether a man, a woman, a Martian, I don't care. What he can't do is take the bait. When a journalist, male or female, or several of them, say all these kinds of things, you have to say, look, you can't go around filing lawsuits. And what's completely pathetic is that on top of that, he says he's filing lawsuits and is willing to provide DNA evidence. But come on, this guy is ridiculous. I mean, I don't know. While we're at it, they might as well run an inspection on Brigitte and we'll clear up any doubts sooner. We really have some ridiculous politicians.
Fernando, my friend, in 12 minutes, Santiago Martinez's show on DMP Geopolitics begins. To wrap up this broadcast, Fernando, here's a riddle. By the way, remember, those who haven't yet given us a thumbs up, please hit the thumbs up, the like against censorship, subscribe, leave comments. Anyone who can support us with a membership or through PayPal, you're very welcome. Our TikTok channel, don't forget it either, with clips, shorts, every day. Well, our social media, and so on. Please support us that way. What's the difference, dear Fernando, between water and vodka, dear Fernando?
Guess what? The difference is that one has alcohol and the other doesn't, for example.
Well, apparently the Russians determined that there's an even greater difference in the properties of both drinks. Pay attention to this, dear Fernando. Let's see. Water on one side, vodka on the other. Pay attention. Water on the left, vodka on the right.
Well, look, I don't know this thing.
Right now, I'm going to do the test. I'll do the test, and when the show is over, I'll look around to see if I have any vodka and check if this actually sounds like that.
A crystal glass only.
Glass?
Nothing else works, right? No, they don't have that effect. Dear Fernando, as always, a pleasure talking with you. To all our listeners, thank you very much for joining us. In a little while, Santiago Martinez, and we'll continue with our programming, as always. Don't miss it. Episode number 300, the 300th talk last Friday, with Fernando and Juan Antonio answering your questions. Really, a very good broadcast. Very, very interesting. You can find it in this week's video list. To Beatriz Pulido, our moderator, as always, a kiss, dear Beatriz. Dear Fernando, a hug, and see you soon.
See you later.